Well, welcome everyone. I've got a great privilege of having two people I know and whose work I very much admire, both architects. So we have Nikki-Marie Jansson. She's done her master's in a very interesting subject. We'll talk a lot about this on the structural use of stone. She's doing her doctorate at the moment. Got lots of balls, so Nikki. You've got a practice, and as well as doing your doctorate. Your doctorate is being done up at Newcastle. And then Andrew Gould, as I'd consider the leading Orthodox architect in America. He lives in beautiful Charleston. I haven't been there yet, but from all the photographs, a very beautiful place. His company is New World Byzantine. I understand that you're primarily working on churches now, though you've got a history of doing traditional builds as well, haven't you?
That's right.
And also founded the wonderful Orthodox Liturgical Arts Journal, which I encourage you to visit and read articles in if you haven't already done so. Another thing I like about Andrew is that he's hands-on. So he founded the New World Byzantine Studios, which makes and supplies liturgical works like lighting and that sort of thing. Wonderful. So in these podcasts, I'm particularly interested in doing anything that will raise the standard of liturgical arts in the West. And obviously architecture is the home of liturgical art. So I've often thought as the Orthodox Church grows, which it is very much in America and this country, we're going to have to start building more churches. I think in America, you're more inclined to do it than we are here. We just take over existing churches. But nonetheless, new churches will be built. And I'm really keen that we establish the principles of good liturgical art, good liturgical architecture, so as that where all these principles are in our mind before we start building, because I've seen so many churches built rather hastily without a real understanding of the theology and the aesthetic principles and structural principles. So this is what's behind these series of podcasts to discuss and try to unearth some of these timeless principles. Now, both of you I know are very keen on the importance of materials in architecture, with you, Nikki, particularly stone, and I know, Andrew, that you design in lots of different materials according to the indigenous materials, but I know you're into thick walls wherever possible. So my opening question really is the importance of the choice of appropriate materials, which of course will vary from place to place. But I'd love to hear from both of you the role that materials have in this, just limited to church architecture. So Nikki, what are your thoughts of the importance of using an appropriate material, and what would be some guidelines in choosing a material that's suitable for a particular church, wherever that might be?
Yeah, I mean, it's worth just noting that I've not actually built a new build church, but it's certainly something that I'm interested in. It's connected with my research, so Andrew can definitely comment more on the liturgical application or the ecclesiastical application of using materials structurally. But certainly I mean, if we just observe in the UK vernacular types of architecture, first and foremost, they're driven by or informed by the locality of materials, so indigenous materials. And I more and more so, I'm starting to acknowledge how important that is I think before even getting to the drawing board and discussing form or perhaps layout or footprint of a building. It's understanding, first of all, what materials you have to work with, what's most local, perhaps. Historically, that's always been stone, timber, earthen material, really. So you see actually, especially in the Highlands in Scotland, the old croft houses, which were sort of stone and earthen material, and usually always hybrid. So stone always makes an appearance somewhere, usually, but even in timber buildings for foundations and things like this. But I guess my reason for mentioning that is because the material informs the basic structural principles that can be applied, and that by nature is a geometry. So it imposes sort of a baseline geometry that you can work with to try and create the most out of the, I guess, the spatial features of the actual architecture. So it gives some constraints, some helpful constraints, I think, to the artistic element that comes with design. And I think it always usually feels more authentic as well in a space, and it can be noticed, it can be felt through the acoustics of a space, through the tactility of a space, smell, everything. So yeah, perhaps that's a bit of an introduction for Andrew to add to, but I would say locality is super important. Understanding the strength of different materials, the strengths and weaknesses of different materials. You know, stone, for instance, works incredibly well in compression, timber in tension, and it's why you see so many vaults, arches, and things like this. I mean, because most
I
church
suppose
buildings were
practically as
stone.
well, before diesel lorries, you wanted to use local materials. It was a really complicated job to cart stone from the other end of the country when you had it on your doorstep.
Yeah.
Nowadays, it's not too difficult to uh, shift stone around vast distances, but it was just a practical thing, which had the wonderful byproduct of rooting it in place.
And you see like the old stave churches in Norway and Scandinavia. I don't know if you're familiar with those.
Yes, yes, certainly.
It's sort of tiered. Um, I imagine they were inspired by Eastern Byzantine architecture because they're very early on, but you see how they've applied the spatial principles of an orthodox ecclesiastical building, but to the properties, the structural properties and potentials of timber, which works completely different way to stone. And it's so interesting what comes of it, but it's its own vernacular. It's still authentic, it's still liturgical, but it's different. So
You've been very good at that, Andrew, as I mentioned, of studying and appreciating the vernacular for all your churches. So you've designed wooden ones, stone ones, all sorts. So could you tell us from your experience the importance of material?
Yeah, well, it's nice to start by talking about England because I'm really struck visiting England how very local the materials are. I'm sure it's partly because the geology of Britain is very diverse and on quite a compact scale. You have like a very different stone in one county from the next county. Um, and of course, you have a lot of buildings that are pre-railroads, so people didn't move stone very far most of the time. So yeah, you can very easily see as you drive around the UK that there's, you know, a certain stone that prevails here, and you drive 30 minutes and there's a totally different stone that prevails there, and that's a really beautiful thing to see. We don't it's not quite like that in the United States, because of course most of our sort of colonial era construction was made out of wood. And then as we get into, you know, 19th century construction, most of it is mass-produced bricks that were carried around by the millions on the railroads, and you know, brick buildings look much the same everywhere. Um, but we do have some expression of local stone in America. We particularly in Pennsylvania, there's a lot of 18th and early 19th century buildings that are made out of a very distinctive schist that they call Pennsylvania fieldstone. I think the German immigrants to Pennsylvania had a tradition of building out of stone far more than other areas in colonial America. And then in the Midwest, we have a limestone belt that runs up through the middle of the country from Texas up through Missouri, Indiana, up into Michigan. And all through there, you see kind of utilitarian old buildings, sort of industrial and farm structures were very often built out of sort of big blocks of low grade yellowish limestone. And that's very distinctive of the Midwest. You know, we have some very fine stone in America, you know, the beautiful white marbles and the very fine Indiana limestone that like our Capitol buildings in Washington, D.C. are built out of. But of course, those were industrially quarried and sent to whatever cities in the country were building fine civic buildings. So those aren't really perceived as having a very local expression here. Yeah, in my own work, yeah, I'm really focused on trying to trying to authentically express the structural qualities of materials, which is to say that I like to use wood in a way that looks like wood, timber trusses, log walls, wood paneling, that sort of thing. And I like to use masonry in the ways that are characteristic of masonry, which is to say thick walls, arched openings. And it's obvious looking at old buildings that material was the primary driver of design. An old wooden building looks completely different from an old brick building or an old stone building. And this mentality was still alive and well in the 19th century when they started building out of iron, that a 19th century iron building, like a train shed or iron bridge, something like that, is it's a whole new expression with whole new forms, that is perfectly appropriate to that new material. It's a huge frustration that with modern architecture, material expression has almost completely disappeared as a design philosophy. It's surprising because it was claimed to be a major part of early modernism, was sort of an authentic scientific expression of material sciences. But that didn't really last very long. Nowadays, modern construction is almost always a hidden skeleton. You have no idea looking at a building whether there's a concrete frame or a steel frame or wood framing in there, and then it's clad with some veneer, that will often disguise it to be a brick building or a stone building, or just clad in sheets of glass or aluminum, and with no suggestion of structural expression at all. So yeah, it's quite a
Orthodox churches that are built to look like a traditional stone church with arches and domes, but in fact it's all wood with plasterboard.
yeah, absolutely, and that's it's endemic in my country that New Orthodox churches are have some hidden steel or wood frame, and and then they're all plasterboarded over to look like a sort of poor imitation of medieval Byzantium. And these buildings are very depressing to me when you see them under construction, because they'll have a steel frame that's actually holding the roof up, which will be straight elements, columns and lintels and so forth. And then they'll have another steel frame that's completely non-structural in order to create all of the curved vaults and domes inside. And that's just sort of a light gauge steel frame that's hanging off of the structural steel frame to hold the plasterboard. So you can really see that deceit in the building while it's being built.
Especially if it isn't done well. So I see ones with a flat roof and they sort of punched a hole in and had a dome on it. The dome
That's right.
floating in here. It's just something impossible to do unless you've got this hidden steel.
Yes, yeah, exactly. We have many churches like that have a dome with no columns, no arches to support it.
So Nick, you're going to say something.
I was just going to say, on a pragmatic level, it's sometimes not even cost effective to build in that way. Obviously, there's a question of skills availability for building something that's structurally more authentic. There might not be the skills available, for instance, to build a stone dome or even a concrete dome, cast in situ, for instance. So it's understandable why some of these processes are undertaken, but at the same time, I think there's a more broader philosophical reason, perhaps, to wanting to build in a structurally authentic way, because it's also about process. I think any building is about process and about the community or those taking part in the activity enjoying the process and admiring the process of the construction and being able to reflect on that and tell stories about it to next generations. It's the poetics of construction is important. It's not just about the product. But of course, it's incredibly difficult nowadays to pursue a project in that manner. And yeah, I mean, Andrew, you've worked on so many church projects. I can imagine that some have been more dreamlike in that sense, but others have been incredibly challenging, dealing with just the constraints of and logistics of practice, and you have to make big compromises, and it's not always ideal for the architect or designer, but it's reality. So finding that balance, I imagine, is
You're building
incredibly.
a church at the moment, I'm sure. You just finished it with you concrete blocks, but you're actually building it as though it was stone. One of the posts of church committees against using stone or more traditional methods, even if it's concrete block, is cost. But I mean, how much more costly would it be to make the same church out of your steel frame and wood and all that, and would it last as long? Therefore, is the long-term economics of it actually worthwhile? Apart from, Nikki, what you say is so important, that the process is just part of the building. I very much believe that liturgical art should be a microcosmic expression of our priestly relationship with ordered creation.
Yeah.
And if you have all these, well, kind of deceptive building methods, there's no, all the symbolism is completely gone. You couldn't have a sermon on the wonders of how this building was made. There should be preaching a sermon on deception rather than stones being built up and etc. etc. But the cost difference, I mean, out of interest, just a rough idea, what would be the cost difference between building, let's just say, solid concrete block with domes and arches and reproducing externally that in plasterboard, etc.?
Well, it's hard to say. If you compare the construction cost of just sort of structuring your building with a steel frame versus just structuring your building with concrete walls and arches, the concrete will be far more expensive than the steel when you're looking at that as an isolated line item in the budget. However, at the finishing end, there's a lot of savings when you're building out a solid construction, because if you build the building with solid walls and arches, then your structure is also the finished form of the building. So, putting a coat of stucco on the exterior of that building is actually a much cheaper finish than having to build up layers of waterproofing and insulation, and then lathing and stuccoing that. And then likewise on the interior, if your goal is to have an actual plastered interior, hand-applied plaster as opposed to plaster board, hand applying that plaster onto a solid masonry surface is actually much less expensive than sort of furring it out, isolating it, putting up some kind of plasterboard substrate, and then putting plaster on top of that. So my sense is, having built a number of buildings like this, is that if you want a building that has hand applied finishes like real stucco and real plaster, and has all of the thicknesses and expression of an authentic masonry building, I think the cost differences kind of disappear. That it probably is just as affordable to simply build what you want it to look like, rather than build something differently and then go through a lot of finishing gymnastics to make it look like that. On the other hand, if you're content with kind of a cheap and fakey looking building that's got, a styrofoam exterior and a plasterboard interior, and you're not trying very hard to disguise the sort of, steel form of the structure, yeah, that building undoubtedly is cheaper to do out of the fake materials. But it's not because the materials are cheaper, it's just because they're not trying very hard to make it a good building.
Yeah. And there's also a hazard that comes with that, using synthetic materials. And I mean, you see that with the cladding crisis in the UK and London with Grenfell Tower, if you're familiar. And using synthetic materials, it might be cost saving in the short term, but it costs a lot more in the long term, and comes with social repercussions. So these things are also important to consider, especially in sacred spaces. The other thing would also depend on, I mean, the stone variety, the ease of procurement of that material, the availability of it, and also the form it's in, because the more processed it is, the more expensive that piece of stone will be. The different bed heights in the quarry will have different corresponding costs depending on demand, supply and demand, and things like this. So it's actually in the UK. I'm working with a few quarries in the research I'm doing, and they have a lot of waste material on their quarries, waste material that's perfectly usable, but not appealing to the commercial industry because they're looking for very clean, thinly sliced panels for cladding purposes, which is actually very inefficient and well, not a very sensible way to use stone, but that's where the demand is at the moment. So they have lots of sort of rubble stone and even big blocks of stone that they can't sell. So they're quite happy to flog that for quite cheap. So if you have the right client on a project and know the quarrier, you can get the resource for very cheap. But then it's a question of how do you fund the labor? I mean, first of all, is there the labor? Are there the skills to work with that material? Up north and in Scotland, and also throughout the UK, but especially up here where I'm working now in Newcastle, Northern England and Scotland area, there's lots of local stonemasons who can do that. But then I guess if you're working on a larger scale with a bigger contractor, then you have risk to consider. They charge for risk. And if it's a construction method that's less familiar to them, they're used to working with concrete, timber, steel, the actual cost of the construction, the materials might be more affordable, but they will add sort of a twofold overhead just for risk in case something goes wrong. And that's the big challenge, I think, now, at least in the UK. I don't know how it compares to the US, but it's, yeah, trying to kind of re-educate not just the general public and contractors, but architects as well, and understanding, having more of a confidence to be able to use these materials that have been used for thousands of years and performed for thousands of years, not just structurally, but also in sort of a thermal capacity and acoustic capacity and holding cultural value and things like this. So yeah, cost is a funny one. It really depends on the project, I think, and the client.
Also, I think what factors one considers when one's thinking is this economical.
Yeah.
You can have something that's economical which can be pulled down in 30 years, but if you're thinking it's going to be economical for future generations, one that's high maintenance after 40 years, you're actually giving your grandchildren a really uneconomical building.
Yeah.
So, acoustics. I lived in Greece for a while in Mount Athos for 2 years, and I mean, Thessaloniki for a year, and I've done some research recently, or rather read other people's research on acoustics in these old buildings. And it's astounding the acoustic qualities they have. Partially it's the size of the space, that really good resonance, but it's no doubt the materials. Could you both talk a bit about the acoustic advantages of solid, whatever it is, stone or brick or concrete blocks, for acoustics over, say, plasterboard?
Yeah,
you've got to use microphones, and then it's completely different church service compared to the.
Well, sure. Orthodox churches, of course, aim for a big reverberant acoustic, which almost no modern building type aims for that. You know, modern buildings are almost always aiming to dampen down the acoustics as much as possible and to handle everything with an electronic system. But Orthodox churches, if you build them with a traditional proportion, which is to say a lot of volume and a lot of height, you know, particularly a lot of volume up above people's heads where sound can bounce around without being absorbed by people's bodies, you know, that's the most important thing for getting good reverberation. Hard solid surfaces are important. You know, flimsy surfaces like plasterboard and thin wood paneling absorb the bass. The bass frequencies in particular out of the sound, and that bass reverberation is such a distinctive part of the Orthodox aesthetic, in particular musically. You know, the Eson or the big Russian bass sound. Interestingly, sort of a kind of an organic or handmade imperfection is really important for good acoustics. That modern buildings that are built too precisely, where the surfaces are excessively flat, have kind of a harsh acoustic because they favor certain resonant frequencies between these perfectly parallel surfaces. Whereas, buildings that are more handmade, where everything's a little bit out of square and plumb and the plaster is kind of soft and rounded, these old buildings have a beautiful, warm, soft, gentle acoustic that's equal across all frequencies, and that's a remarkably easy thing to perceive in construction. But I'd be very interested to hear from Nikki about the acoustic properties sort of different stones in particular. Of course, having a solid wall is important, but stone is not entirely solid, as it were. A lot of stone is porous. And there's a big difference between an interior that's polished marble and an interior that's limestone. So do these sort of acoustic signatures of material factor into your work, Nikki?
Well, it's certainly not what my focus is at the moment, but it's really fascinating, and I hadn't really thought about what you said in terms of the flatness of contemporary architecture. It makes so much sense now that you mention it, and the beauty of the imperfection, or the tactility of traditional materials. It's important on a technical level or even a scientific level. It's not just about nostalgia and having a rough stone wall just so that you can look at it and feel warm and fuzzy. So it's not about that. These things, the beauty really is in the practical role that these things have on a very subtle level. But in terms of different stone types, yeah, every stone really is porous to a degree. Even a hard basalt granite or even a slate has, well, slate maybe not many, but some pores, micropores. But yeah, obviously to varying degrees. And sandstones especially, sandstones are the stone type that I'm focusing a lot of the research on because there's such a variety up in Northern England and Scotland. And some are incredibly porous and weak materials. You could crush them in your hand, and others are so strong they almost perform in the same way as a granite that's almost completely impervious to water, for instance. So it's interesting. Yeah, I would have thought the surface finish of the material plays more of a significant role than perhaps the porosity. I'm not too sure. It's not an area of research that I'm focusing on, but certainly if a surface is polished versus whether it's sort of hacked by hand or with an axe or would make a difference. But when you mention acoustics, I always think of the acoustic jars that you find in old Roman architecture, or I guess pre-Roman, pre-Christ even. I think Vitruvius speaks about these acoustic jars that are found in domes in his 10 books on architecture. So this goes back, but the consideration for it in especially liturgical architecture was so detailed. So I'm guessing that's to add reverberation, isn't it, in the dome of these liturgical spaces?
The domes themselves absolutely add reverberation because they're like a chamber where there's nothing that would absorb the sound, and the sound can bounce around quite a lot up in the dome and then make its way back down to the ground. And in a proper Byzantine or Russian proportion church, where the whole cupola, which is to say the drum under the dome, is well above the floor and has a relatively vertical proportion, you can hear a really beautiful effect in the church, which is that the sound will decay down low first because it's running into people and furniture that's absorbing the sound, but then the sound will continue to reverberate up within the cupola drum for longer, and then it'll gradually work its way back down. And this gives the illusion that the sound is descending from above. So you can hear the choir finish a big chord and then it decays away, and then you kind of look up and you can still hear it coming down from the cupola a couple of seconds later, and it gives an illusion that sort of reinforces the iconography. The iconography is there to say that, like, you know, the hosts of heaven, the angels, are up there singing with us, and you can actually kind of hear that when a church has a big tall cupola. Regarding the terracotta jars that are sometimes built into the walls of churches, I think it's a myth that those have an acoustical purpose. Their purpose is to help the thick walls dry out, and to make them lighter. You typically see those at the four pendentives under the dome, because those are extremely thick and solid. Like, there's often several meters of masonry from the interior to the exterior surface at the pendentives. So they'd often sort of backfill those structures with empty wine jugs, and sometimes they'd have the mouth of them exposed to the inside to help all of that thickness of mortar and masonry dry out. But in general, having holes in the wall like that is not good for acoustics, because a hole is going to absorb the sound. Much like it does with a highly porous stone. I'll tell you an interesting anecdote about how much difference surface porosity makes. I build most of my churches out of concrete block, what colloquially is known as cinder block, which of course has it's a hard material, but it has a very porous surface texture. And when the church is all finished and roofed, and it's just raw concrete block, it is totally acoustically dead. You can sing in there and you don't hear anything come back from those walls. And then when they're plastered, suddenly you have 4 seconds of reverberation. So that goes to show that having a surface which I'm not to say that plaster is non-porous. Plaster is of course porous on a microscopic level, but it's not porous on a macroscopic level. And having just that difference between the porosity being microscopic and the porosity being macroscopic makes an absolute world of difference between how reflective the surface is.
Gosh, that's fascinating.
Imperfection. It was very interesting gauging the response of people who visited the Hermitage, where I used to live. So restored these old stone buildings. And it was quartzite, which you just can't work. It's just so hard. So you had to build with rough stone, which meant the inside of the walls were quite undulating. So one could have put a massive amount of lime plaster on to make it perfectly flat, but I thought aesthetically and economically it wasn't a good idea. So I'd sort of go with the undulations and then use lime wash with natural pigments in. And just the response of people to that when they visited was just so different than if it was just a flat wall. They just sort of fell in love with it, and that was a sign of a perfect imperfection, that it had a human hand to it, but it wasn't a mechanical finish. And that really taught me a lot about, as you say, I said earlier, Nikki, there's a history to it. You can actually read the history of it in a way that perhaps you could read the history of a mechanically made church of a building, but it's not an interesting history. I want to think of a factory looking at some of these surfaces rather than craftsmen.
Yeah, it has a different soul to it, I guess.
In the light of that known history, you can get 2 paintings. One would be sort of made by some modern machine and technically look very similar to the original, but if you knew the difference in history, you'd respond very, very differently. The one made by the hand of the master and the other just made by some genius computer.
Yeah, there's a toil and there's a labor and a love and a joy that goes into any form of craft, and also an embodied knowledge that is part of what it's what makes us identify as a humanity, I think, with the environment, with each other, reflecting on these processes of craft. Lime mortar lime in general is an amazing material. I was recently at a workshop up in Scotland learning more about the potentials of lime mortar and the heritage science of the material. Fascinating, looking microscopically at different types of compositions that were used historically by the Romans, by the Saxons, it's absolutely fascinating. And like you said, lime mortar is known to be breathable, like a breathable material. But at the same time, I guess it's the pores are at such a micro scale that, as you said, it provides a very specific acoustic sort of quality or performance. And this I don't know too much about, but it's very interesting to acknowledge when we're building and designing. Also, I guess the flooring, Andrew and Aidan, how much of a difference does the floor make? I mean, churches I've visited over here, at least, the ones with like timber herringbone floors or carpet down the central aisle or the nave, it adds quite a homely feeling, especially if you're surrounded by a lot of stone. And perhaps it's to muffle the sound of people's shoes clonking on the floor. But I don't know, how does that work with the rest of the architecture?
Yeah, the floor matters a lot because it's a huge amount of the surface area of the space. When I built my first church, my parish here in Charleston, I noticed a big acoustical difference when we varnished the wood floor. It's a pine floor, and the pine boards are, you know, quite smooth. They're smooth, you know, modern planed boards. And it was the very last step of completing the church interior before we moved in, was varnishing the floor, and there was almost a doubling in the length of the reverberation time when they put the shiny varnish on the floor versus when it was just raw wood, which was amazing. Now, that was when the building was completely empty. Most of that extra reverberation the shiny floor gave us disappeared when we filled it with people and furniture and carpets, because, you know, then we're covering that floor up. So that is one area in which the floor's contribution to the acoustics is somewhat mitigated, is that the floor is going to make very little difference if the building's packed with people.
Do you think there are any modern materials that do have potential for use in churches without any lessening of their theological, acoustic qualities, etc.? When pre-stressed concrete is probably the most reasonably modern. Concrete itself, of course, isn't modern. The Romans used it, a hydraulic line, basically. But are there any that you think have any potential at all? Or not? I'll be happy for you to say no, but
Well,
opinions are.
Well, I mean, I use steel in my buildings to an extent. I mean, you know, if there's a basement under the church, I'll often have steel beams supporting the floor of the church. You know, and of course there's all kinds of, you know, steel hardware running all through it to help, you know, meet modern earthquake and wind codes. Yeah, I don't have any ideological problem with modern materials. You know, I have a church under construction that's got beautiful leaded glass windows, and the glass is handmade, the leading is traditionally done, but they're in modern aluminum frames for perfectly practical reasons. And it's like, if I can use modern materials in a way that doesn't undermine the traditional aesthetic, and hopefully isn't, like, you know, wildly deceitful, you know, I have no problem with them.
I would totally agree. I think it, for me, it's more to do with the process of assembly being authentic to the material. So if it makes sense to, especially if you're refurbishing old stone buildings or churches, as you have here in the UK, lots of very old medieval churches need refurbishing, and it might be that you want to open up part of the church and you need a material that will span, and so it makes sense to put a big steel beam in. But I think then to own it and to make a feature of it in a sort of creative way, it adds to the spirit of a place and the history and sort of tracing of the tracing of the history. Really, you can understand what's old and new, and so I think there can be a beauty to that hybrid. But there are also materials like, for instance, timber. You can use mass timber, but then you've got the realm of CL cross-laminated timber and engineered timbers and all of this that have their strengths and applications, but I think then using them in a way that's truthful to what those potentials are, rather than just trying to make it, as Andrew mentioned earlier, trying to be pastiche about it and covering up and layering to pretend something is what it isn't. I think that's what troubles me with a lot of contemporary buildings. I think if you're going to make a concrete building or put an aluminium frame in, then either have it exposed, or, I mean, it can be, sure, you can exercise creative license, paint over it or whatever, and sometimes you see it's, even if the architect has an intention, the user might come in and say, oh no, that doesn't look nice, let's patch over it with some plasterboard, and that's fine. It's quite quirky and I think cheerful, but at the moment we start pretending things aren't what they are, it's a shame, in my opinion.
So let's just say there's a priest and a committee who want to build a new church in England, let's just say. They haven't got an architect they're going to use who has any experience in Orthodox churches, but they're a good architect, you know, they're sympathetic, they haven't got any sort of hyper-modernist approaches, don't want to do a brutalist piece of architecture. But the priest and the committee need to give a brief to the architect so that what is produced is sympathetic to the liturgy. Obviously, materials have already come up, and being true to the materials, considering acoustic qualities. What other things would you wish that priest or committee would give in their brief to the architects, so they weren't hiving off in a direction? Because this is very much the case in this country. We haven't got people like Andrew around, so we've got to use architects. And I've been involved in our architectural committee here, and when we thought we had to extend our church, and the first design for the extension was some sort of horrible steel structure that looked ugly anyway, but certainly wasn't appropriate for the church. And then the second architects we had were quite good, but we were learning how to brief them clearly. So a lot of, in the end, still a lot of time was wasted by them not listening to the brief, or us not being I was going to say specific enough, because you don't obviously tell the architect what to do, but you need to at least tell them the principles and how it's going to be used liturgically, etc. So I know there is a balance here. You're not being an architect oneself, you're giving a brief. But what would be the principles, both of you would like a priest to give, so we didn't have some of these problems with materials we're talking about now? What other principles would there be?
I don't know if you want to start, Andrew, but something's sort of jumping out at me to start with.
Please.
I think whether it's a liturgical building or not, understanding the client needs, the true needs of the client and the community is number one for me, and understanding the longevity of a project, maintenance needs, the needs of the community, what funds they have available, what over a long term, to understand, I guess, first of all, the durability of that space and structure.
So you might say, well, we want this church to last 300 years and then we can replace it. Is that sort of thing you're saying, being quite specific?
Yeah, I think so, or indefinitely, let's say, or with a maintenance plan, and what sort of funds are available to maintain that space over that period of time, and who will be maintaining it. Are the congregation mostly elderly, or are there youth there? Are there specialists within the congregation who can provide services, specialist advice and consultation, things like this? Understanding the demographic, I think, of the community first and foremost is so key, and taking the time to have that in-person conversation with the community and the priest. I think that probably comes before the liturgical needs. Not that the liturgical needs are secondary, but they have to be applied within a context, and the context is so important, the human context. And then I think you can start, or at least I would start thinking about materials and things like this in relation to that. For instance, if a congregation envision even like a self-build project, they might not even want to use a main contractor, and they might want to just call in certain tradespeople and then do most of the work themselves. That would really affect the design of a building. The program, the timeline of the construction process, whether that's done in 6 months all in one go or stretched over 5-10 years. So these are important factors to consider. And then, of course, if it's an architect who's unfamiliar with the liturgical practices of the church, to invest some time in speaking with the priest, understanding what's important in the services, what key features should be there, how the space is occupied or inhabited, and things like this. That would be my I guess first point of call.
Thank you.
Yeah, Aidan, the fact that so many modern buildings are sort of designed with the material expression having no relationship to the structure of the building, or oftentimes even the program of the building, I think that habit has kind of given people some bad habits with regards to developing the brief for projects. It's pretty common with an Orthodox church in America that the brief will kind of start with the superficials. We'll say that'll be like, we're Greeks, so it's got to have a big dome and it's got to kind of look like Hagia Sophia. And then from the superficials, they'll kind of work down to the practical stuff of we need this much space in the altar and that big of a narthex and so forth. And they'll kind of expect to get to the point of like a rendering of what the church is going to look like to satisfy all the different parties on the building committee before they even have gotten to the question of like, is this going to be a steel frame job or is it going to be a wood frame job? Are we going to clad this in a brick veneer or a stucco veneer? And the materiality is actually the last thing on their minds. And if you design like that, it's kind of impossible to make the materiality drive the design, which of course is how it should be. Again, we can see very obviously looking at medieval churches that the materiality drives the design. A church built of wood has its shape, and a church built of masonry has its shape, and the shapes are totally different, not because it was, the building committee's taste, but because that's what those materials could do. So in my own work, I have increasingly become a sort of materials first advocate. When I meet with churches, I will meet with churches and I'll just kind of show them, look, here's some churches that I designed that were built out of concrete blocks, maybe with a timber frame roof on top. And like, I'd recommend doing it this way. And if we do it that way, this is more or less how it's going to look and feel. On the other hand, here's a church that I designed entirely in wood. It looks totally different. It feels totally different. That's another choice we could make, and building out of solid logs is another totally different choice from hollow wooden framing. And I'll just say, like, look at these end results that other churches ended up with. Their buildings feel totally different because of the material choices they made. Let's do that material choice first. Let's just say, I really like how these buildings that have got, plastered masonry walls and timber truss roofs, I really like how those feel. And that's usually the ones people like best. Typically people are most attracted to the finished pictures of a church that's got masonry walls and exposed timber roofs. And so I say, well, if that's what you like best, let's just make the decision at the start. That's how we're going to build this church. And then we'll run all of your other priorities, your practical needs of how much space you need here or there, or your sort of cultural expression needs of, wanting it to look Texan or Californian, or to have a Greek versus a Russian cross on top. Let's run all of those design problems through this initial decision of simply what material are we going to authentically build this church out of. And I've found that that's really a much happier process.
Yeah. There's nothing like taking a client to a case study project, because there's certain things that can't be communicated through a drawing. If someone has a good feeling about a space, that's often all they need to convince them. But I totally agree with Andrew. And I think to add to that, the importance of the strategic definition of at the start of the project, and that's the term we use in the UK, but really it's just about developing the business case for the client, I guess, long-term business case. But it's more than just business, it's about values, weighing the short-term costs with the long-term values. If you can convince a client of that they're investing in a process and not just a product that's going to be finished at X date and then forgotten about, usually then the case makes itself, because if you build in a more authentic way and use materials appropriately, they perform better in the long term. And that's a better business case, it's a better cultural case, it's a better everything really. But it's, unless you acknowledge that the project is a process and it's an investment over time, it's very difficult then to justify some of these moves. And so, yeah, but I would agree, material first approach. And modern architecture to me is, well, not only modern architecture, some traditional forms of architecture. It's almost like form follows ideology, and I feel more strongly that form should follow resource, and that's both the geology and also the skills you have available. That's sort of the foundation, and then the creativity springs from that. But if you force an ideology or a dogma and try to generate a form out of nowhere, it's sort of, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. Form following resource is a brilliant way to put it. I've never heard that phrase. It's the idea that form follows function has been a very poor characterization of modern architecture, more or less from the beginning. Modern architects have never really believed that and never really practiced it. But yes, form follows resource is a beautiful way to characterize traditional building. It's good that you keep bringing up sort of institutional longevity and value over the long haul, because of course churches are among the types of clients that ought to think that way. You know, like in the modern world, you know, houses and for-profit commercial buildings, it may not make business sense to think that way because the people who build the buildings don't usually own it very long before they sell it. However, institutions that do, for instance, universities and hospitals and government buildings, they really do consider long-term cost as more important than short-term construction cost. And I know with commercial construction in America, like a new university building or a new government building will often have triple the cost per square foot of a similar looking, you know, new for-profit office building, for instance. And that's simply because they're making material choices in every detail of their construction, you know, using lots and lots of stainless steel, for instance, lots of copper flashing, just a higher grade of material everywhere, because they're figuring like, we don't want to have to do a major renovation on this building for 75 years, whereas the guy who builds a, you know, a strip mall is figuring, you know, major renovation is probably going to be in 5 or 10 years, and I'm not even going to own it at that point. So churches should think that way. They should be willing to pay, you know, double or triple now in order to not have hugely expensive problems 50 or 100 years out. Unfortunately, churches don't usually think that way. Probably part of that is just that Orthodox churches in particular don't have much money usually, whereas hospitals and universities and governments seem to have access to virtually infinite money. You know, anything they say they need, they have the money for. So yeah, it is a struggle in my work that, you know, I may know the church would be better off spending more, and the church may know they'd be better off spending more, but if they simply don't have that much money, or have access to it, it's, you know, it's difficult. And that's the case with all of my projects. Every project I do for the Orthodox Church, you know, we aim high, and basically clients only choose me if they're going to aim high. I mean, somebody who wants to build a cheap building is not going to hire me, but they hire me because they want to do something splendid. But pretty often they just can't find the money for it and it can't get built.
Yeah, I mean it's totally understandable as well. It's a real challenge. Have you in any of your projects, have you been creative in like the project program? Have you had to stretch the construction over several years and do things incrementally to try and manage that budget over time and sort of incrementally fundraise it?
Yes. Yeah, with my projects, we typically sort of strip everything out of the construction contract that we can and still have a building that the bank or that the permitting authorities will consider a finished habitable building.
And ensure.
Yeah, but yeah, often like the finished plaster will pull out of the contract, the finished floor will pull out of the contract. We might downgrade the roof from a copper roof to an asphalt shingle roof in the contract. Not because we're really planning to build it that way, but because we have to get the initial construction budget number down to where it looks on paper like they can afford it. But then once we start building, it's going to take a year or two to build it. So that's a year or two more that we can fundraise and add those beautiful finishes back in. That's a very good strategy for churches, because churches usually have access to more money after their church is built than before their church is built. And people are much more willing to donate to a project that's actually happening than to a project that only might happen.
That's so true.
Yeah. Another thing I always recommend to churches is pull all of the risk of cost overruns off of your builder and onto the church, because a big part of the price that a builder will quote for a construction project is contingency pricing to cover all the risk of cost overruns, and the risk of cost overruns are substantial with sort of slow handmade construction like we favor. So I always say, the nice thing about cost overruns, the cost overruns will probably happen. You'll probably have to pay for them. But the nice thing about cost overruns is they happen later. They don't happen at the very beginning. So structure your contract so that the contractor only has to pay for what he expects to pay for, move all the risk of cost overruns onto the client, and you'll be able to afford those cost overruns because they're going to happen a year from now or 2 years from now when you're finishing the building, not when you're starting the building, and you'll have more money then.
Yeah, it can be quite daunting.
Longevity as a wall painter is, I feel very awkward about spending a lot of time wall painting a church. It was just plasterboard. They may have saved £3,000 building that way, but the wall painting of a big church might cost whatever it is, £100,000 or £50,000, but how long will it last? It's just basically being painted on cardboard effectively, which is what. Whereas if I'm painting on a solid structure, I feel actually there's no reason this can't last for 1,000 years. So one's got to think of the liturgical art and not just the shell in which people move. Also, in terms of design as well, once or twice I've been asked to design, this is in America, mosaics for churches which had already been built or the design had been agreed. And I'm thinking of one particular really large Catholic church. The windows were in all the wrong place. Like if you have a fresco or mosaic on the east wall, naturally you want Christ in the middle. That had a whacking big window in the middle. So where do you put Christ? You put him on the side, and then you're the Mother of God on the right, and then that means that they're equally important aesthetically, which is not quite right. And so the design that just didn't have in mind the figurative decoration later. So that's one thing I notice a lot of designs miss out on. They're not thinking from the inside out. Well, we're going to have wall paintings eventually, so we've got to really work with an iconographer in choosing how one space goes into another, how one surface rather goes into another. This is a great thing about pendatives that unites the drum to the cubic nave and so on. And where windows are placed, all these things have a big impact on what you can and cannot do as a wall painter.
Absolutely. What church building did you say that was? Which church was it?
It's about 8 years ago. I can't remember the name of it.
Were they Anglican? Oh, they were all.
It was a Catholic monastery, an enormous monastery being built. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, as you speaking, I remembered that someone had told me that some years back that the space of an Orthodox church is designed around the icons, and obviously you know that very well. You both know that very well. But I guess when we look at Anglican buildings, and especially buildings after the schism in the UK, you start to see, you know, the windows getting bigger and the types of vaulting changing to bring more light into the space as the I guess the doctrine of the church alters, so does the architecture, and like as the ideology changes, so does, you know, Byzantine churches are notoriously dark, deliberately dark. It's about that sort of nighttime setting, and whereas you look at a late Gothic cathedral and it's incredibly bright, but as you say, they didn't have icons in the same way and liturgical art in the same way. So yeah, I don't know if you had any thoughts on that, and especially in renovating some of the later Anglican or Catholic Anglican churches in the UK and retrofitting them to become Orthodox spaces.
Yes, that's one question I wanted to ask Andrew. Probably 90% of Orthodox churches in this country are situated in an Anglican, not so often Catholic, but mainly Anglican, sometimes Methodist churches. So it's a real aesthetic problem. Do you sort of disregard entirely the aesthetics that's there? And as I've said in one case, it is built on entirely new church inside, a rather false way. It's like a stage set with a dome, even though there's no dome on the outside. So what principles would you have, Andrew, in this sort of meeting, as it were, halfway between respecting the liturgical, the aesthetics of that space, but adapting to Orthodox use?
Well, I always say that respecting the stylistic integrity of the building is far more important than having the ideal style. Choice of style is not nearly as important as a building speaking with one voice and having stylistic integrity unto itself. So, you know, whenever I am working with a client who bought a secondhand building, I always try to talk them out of Byzantifying the building, because yeah, of course, if you were building your church from scratch, maybe you would build it in an Eastern style. But if you bought a building, you just have to work with what you have, and the building has to speak, you know, its language of beauty clearly, and any furnishings that you might put in that have to support its voice. You know, with an English church, of course, you typically you more often than not have actual exposed stone on the walls. So you're probably not going to be plastering and frescoing the whole space, but that's fine. You can make big panel icons and hang them around the church, and that's a tradition we see in log churches. There's a whole, you know, a whole tradition of building Orthodox churches out of logs in Ukraine, Romania, Russia, and usually these churches did not have murals painted on the walls. Occasionally they did, but usually they just had big built-in shrines, big framed panel icons on the walls, often a sort of wraparound iconostasis that covers much of the interior. But the point is that, you know, just because a fully sort of domed and frescoed interior is sort of the pinnacle of Eastern Orthodox culture doesn't mean it's the only thing in the tradition. The tradition has lots of room for non-ideal church spaces, humble churches, village churches, you know, where they would work with what they had, and that they would achieve the Orthodox liturgical aesthetic by, you know, putting in a lot of shrines, hanging up beautiful icons, you know, putting in a very good iconostasis. The iconostasis is more important than the architecture, I think, in most cases. You know, when you're in an Orthodox service, you're mainly looking at the iconostasis, and you know, a sort of a domed and Byzantine sort of space with a bad iconostasis is a worse liturgical experience than a sort of, you know, a nicely proportioned second-hand Protestant building that has a really beautiful iconostasis. I think a good iconostasis can solve almost all problems with a building.
And I mean, even the frame of that iconostasis can be incredibly simple. I use very simple materials. It's simply crafted, but the quality of the icons and the love that goes into painting those. There are some examples I'm thinking of in the UK, and even I don't know if you've been to the Edinburgh parish at Meadow Lane, Aidan. Incredibly simple frame for the iconostasis, but you can really feel the love and grace radiating in that space, and it's in such a small room. There's no dome. Nothing.
Well, that's what I found, that most of the icon screens in Britain are either poorly designed. I'm thinking of sort of budget churches, but they just didn't seem to sort of have a good design sense. I mean, I've designed icon screens at really incredibly low budget, sort of £300, but the ways of making them really elegant. On the other hand, I've also seen screens at a really high budget, but just far too florid, just baroque, and it doesn't seem to fit that church. But yeah, as you say, Andrew, it's the thing we look at most. And I think, as with architecture, there's certain principles, I'd say 5 or 6 basic principles, that if you adhere to these, it's going to be difficult to get it wrong. If you don't adhere to them, it's going to be difficult to get it right.
Yeah.
Good. And this is there anything else you'd like to add? We've gone for over an hour. I don't want to take up more of your time.
Nikki, you're a stone expert. I'd be very interested to hear more about. Well, tell us about your field of study, and what exactly you do in the field of advocating for stone construction. And then I'd also really like to hear sort of a little bit of detail about how stone is used in a contemporary stone building in the UK. Like, do you do a solid wall? Do you do a cavity wall? How do you handle moisture?
Well, just for context, I'm trained as an architect, as you are, obviously with far less experience, but I come from practice, really, and I'm still practicing, whilst also doing a PhD and teaching a bit up in Newcastle. And all of the work I'm doing is now focused around advocating for the use of stone, educating students on how to use the material, and raising awareness and things like that. But in the UK, we're facing, I mean, architecturally speaking, obviously there's the issue of procurement, which is an economics of actually procuring and quarrying the stone. But on an architectural level, the biggest issue really is building control, building regulations, currently geared towards more modern materials or construction methods, let's say, layered cavity wall systems. The research I'm doing is focused on dwellings, so exploring the potential of using solid masonry, again, for the construction of homes, low-rise homes. And I'm looking at that on a macro scale of sort of the quarrying economy and industry, skills, resources, but then also on the micro level, the building science. So I'm working with geologists at the British Geological Survey, heritage bodies, Historic England, Historic Environment Scotland, and some quarries and stonemasons to try and bridge that gap between the micro potential and understanding of how these different stone types, that are incredibly diverse in the UK and Scotland, can perform in a structural, like a mechanical capacity, but also thermally. And I think the biggest issue we're facing in terms of building regulations is not so much the structural performance of stone. I mean, it's pretty common knowledge that stone can perform well structurally if you use the right geometry and stone types. But the issue now is really thermal performance, because we have such stringent requirements now for environmental thermal performance of homes, for instance, air tightness, this obsession with U values and having completely sealed enclosure that you then air condition or service in a way that's counterintuitive to traditional construction. Traditional buildings would breathe. They were designed to breathe. It was incredibly important. So trying to marry the two methods is proving challenging. And so the PhD is really looking to try and move away from cavity wall construction, for using stone basically as a cladding element or even a single skin element onto a steel or concrete frame or timber frame, and to try and utilize sort of stone for the full thickness of the wall, and looking at what those different thicknesses need to be depending on the type of stone and the assembly methods and all these sorts of things, and testing the thermal performance of these details. So that's sort of it in a nutshell. But a massive part of it is
on lime plasters with the additives in to
yeah,
have that thermal quality. Like I've used straw stubble mixed with lime for the first layer. It's quite thick and then built up afterwards. So the straw brings carbon dioxide in, which helps set the oxidative rather to help set the lime, makes it lighter, but also creates a certain amount of thermal value.
Yeah. It's incredible really what knowledge we've lost. And actually I'm finding more so that the knowledge is there, but there's so few people who have that knowledge, and it's usually in heritage bodies actually. So there's not much conversation happening between the heritage field and conservation field and commercial construction. And there's also maybe a bit of tension there. I don't know. It's not modern, so it doesn't count. It's not innovative, but in fact they're so innovative, and the material science that is the science research that is happening at these heritage institutions is incredible. I've spoken with so many amazing geologists and material scientists, building physicists who understand things in such a sort of a common sense manner, and they look at modern construction techniques and think, what is happening? Have people just forgotten what's just simple and comfortable to live in? And no one likes to be in an airtight home where they can't breathe, and it's the first thing you want to do is open a window. So what's the and so I think there's a lot of debunking of myths to be done. And a big part of that, which I'm really keen on advocating, is the value of education, just getting kids, young students at university, and just introducing them to some of these experts, tradespeople, practitioners. Even just one lecture can make such a difference. And we have students coming and saying, wow, I'm final year of masters. This is the first time I've heard that stone can actually be used to build a wall, or timber can be used in this way, or it's not taught at all. I mean, there might be the odd few colleges that cover these things, but they're branded as sort of traditionalist. But I think this mindset really needs to change. It's not about this conflict between what's modern and traditional. Tradition is just it's a customary practice that's proven to work over time, and it's served its purpose, and so it's been adopted for many years. It's not an ideology.
And that is true that modern materials, each individual material, they're trying to make a strong or whatever, have one particular quality. I'm thinking of cement versus lime renderings. Of make the renderers or the pointing between the bricks as strong as possible.
Wrong.
But I don't look at the holistic thing. And as we've learned from dry detriment, that instead of the pointing being sacrificed over the centuries, the brick or the stone gets sacrificed.
Yeah.
So this thing of strong and might is right.
Yeah.
It's just right against common sense. It's against what history has told us.
Yeah.
And I think that's the thing that's got to change, that you've got to look at the whole, and therefore often each part's got to become a little bit weaker to keep everything in balance.
Yeah. And that comes with a responsibility, and that part of that responsibility is maintenance. And so that I think we're less willing to adopt that lifestyle, because it means a slight change in lifestyle, at least on a certain level, and it doesn't suit commercial living, commercial workplace environments, the pace of city life. It requires a slowing down of things, whether that's a slowing down of the design process, or a slowing down in construction, or a slowing down in just daily life, so
how can you
it's a
get over
responsibility.
if you're a solid wall construction nowadays, how can you get over the thermal problem? Because with the desire to have
Yeah.
use less fossil fuel for central heating. Obviously,
Yeah.
it's important that our houses are well insulated. So, have you got any ideas of how to overcome that problem if you have solid stone walls?
Well, hopefully I'll have more answers in the next
I
few
know.
years. But in principle, um, when you look at the thermal physiology of the human body and how we lose heat predominantly, it's predominantly through radiation. So heat loss by radiation. So that's basically heat that is lost through a temperature differential with a material or the building fabric. You lose very little heat through air temperature. And now with the servicing of buildings being focused so much on air conditioning, it's counterintuitive because you're pumping a lot of energy and effort and money into installing these systems into modern and traditional buildings, but they're incredibly inefficient when it comes to actually catering for the needs of the human body. And so I think that the work I'm doing is trying to go back to first principles of, physiology and understanding of what the building fabric needs to be in the first place, in the context that it's in as well, because that makes a huge effect. Even certain areas in north of England, I mean, if you go from east to west, you've got much more rainfall in the west coast, and the prevailing wind's different on the east coast, and then Scotland this, and it affects the thermal performance of a building, or the thermal potential of a building, even if you're using the same type of stone in these different places. So, as you said, it's a holistic approach to construction, and that's relatively complex to try and make sense of, but usually the solutions are very simple. But the challenge is trying to find a methodology that can be applied, maybe on regional scales, and work from there. But I think we have to unlearn some of the approaches we've taken and become so comfortable with, accepting that maybe a ground source heat pump isn't necessarily the way forward. It might be appropriate for certain cases, but heating the fabric is usually, I mean, the Romans did this. They had on-floor heating and things like this. Heating the fabric at a low, steady temperature is generally much more efficient long term than spiking the temperatures up and then dropping them. It's also costly nowadays to be spiking the
This
temperature.
happened at the Protarton church in Carriers in Mount Athos. This was I think a 13th, 12th, 13th century church, and then the wall paintings had lasted incredibly well. And then they put central heating in, and within 2 years, more damage was done than the previous centuries because they would turn them on. Of course, the air would get full of moisture, but turn them off when the service had finished. That moisture would then go into the colder walls, and this radical change from day to day, well, within a day rather, just deteriorated the works very, very quickly. So that's an example of
This is it.
having the holistic, almost
Yeah.
sort of body really.
Yeah, it is. It's an organism really, and there's such an obsession with like sustainability now, in the sense of let's make biomaterials, and you think we've got a biomaterial to work with. One's called timber, one's called mud, one's called stone. These are biomaterials. They work on a microscopic level, in very similar ways to almost our skin. So I think understanding that is probably the starting point. And also looking at the history of construction, not just through the lens of fabric, but how buildings were occupied, and the dressing of buildings, things like, curtains, carpets, tapestries, wall cloths, fireplaces. These were mechanisms for creating sort of comfortable environment, an immediate comfortable environment, without having to heat a whole building. You'd heat a certain space or sit there with a hot brick on your lap. Obviously, these are quite archaic methods now, but perhaps some similar approaches could be applied and accepted nowadays. That, you can't it's not sustainable to aim for a steady temperature at this level consistently. I mean, it's
Yeah,
there's
it's not
compromise
it's
with it.
not necessary.
Yeah,
Just a couple of weeks ago when I was in London, I went to church at the Chapel Royal at Hampton Court Palace, and it was very cold in there. I don't think they heat the building because it's an an old heritage building, and the organist was wearing a winter coat, and it was delightful. It was so perfectly quiet in there to not have the that background hum of a heating system. And you only noticed it at first, but once you were into the rhythm of the service, it was perfectly fine, that it was cold in there during the
mm,
service. Um, yeah, I thought that was beautiful. It's funny, in my house here in Charleston, my heating system has been broken for the past 5 months. I've gone the entire winter with no heating system, and it's been perfectly fine. Um, I light a fire in the fireplace if it's a particularly cold night, and it warms the house up. And if it's a cold, I use an extra blanket. But for the most part, we have enough people in our house and enough cooking going on that the house is just passively plenty warm enough.
yeah.
Um, I'll need to get my system fixed before the summer because we really do need we really do need cooling in Charleston. But I realize that having a central heating system is completely unnecessary in this climate. Yeah, back to the question of like, can you actually build a totally uninsulated sort of mass wall structure? We do that sometimes in America in certain regions. A whole sort of corner of our country that's got like a dry desert climate, sort of from Texas, um, Oklahoma, Arizona, that's whole southwestern corner of our country. Pretty much year round, it's hot in the daytime and cold at nighttime, which means that an uninsulated brick or stone building performs ideally. It'll keep the temperature inside the building a comfortable medium all the time with no heating and no cooling system. And so in that climate zone, yeah, the building code absolutely allows completely uninsulated mass wall construction. And there are some sort of non-standard boutique builders who do build houses like that. I know of an architect, Patrick Lemon, in Oklahoma, who's built beautiful, beautiful, just solid brick houses. There's also some builders in Texas that build kind of inexpensive one-story houses out of giant blocks of limestone. Um, and it's actually a cheap way to build in parts of the Midwest that have like sort of 18-inch thick beds of limestone running through the dirt. You can just kind of claw these out of the ground with an excavator. They don't even really need to be quarried, and then you can just stack them up and build walls, and it's actually a very cheap way to build. I'm starting a project for a parish in Missouri where we're hoping to build the church in that way.
Oh, fantastic. Yeah.
Mhm.
So it's permissible by the regulations in certain areas, you said, to build homes
Well,
that
yes,
way.
it is. Well, so
That's not
there's
the case in the UK. I
so yeah. Well, in America, of course, we
homes.
have we have almost every climate in America. It goes all the way from tropical to desert to worse than Siberia up in Minnesota. So the environmental codes vary enormously depending on which climate zone we're in. I'm working on designing a church in Puerto Rico, and in Puerto Rico, absolutely nobody insulates anything. It's a tropical island climate where it's pretty much the same temperature year round, and there's no reliable electricity, so most people don't even have any heating or air conditioning systems. Um, but there's other places in America that, yeah, you need enormous insulation values because they're
Yeah.
cold, wet climates, and because they're heavily regulated states. So we have our notorious political diversity in America that results in some states having horrendous red tape and regulation for environmental stuff, and other states have essentially none whatsoever. Um, we also have a lot of instances where there's rural counties where the county doesn't even employ a building official and simply doesn't enforce any building codes, regardless of what the state law might say. So I've built a number of churches in places like that.
That's pretty great for an
Yeah.
architect.
There's some movement within England. I think this is a Scandinavian approach. Up until recently, we've always thought all the insulation's on the inside, the outside is just to keep the weather out. Now they're beginning to swap over so that you might have your blocks inside and your insulation on the outside, so that the inside blocks of brick, whatever, act as a heat sink.
Yeah.
And so that's
Yeah, and that's smart, because a building that has thermal mass needs less than half the R value of a building that doesn't have internal thermal mass. This is even written into the building codes, at least here in America. If I just look in the chart in the building code that says how much R value I need, it'll say, like, if it's a hollow framed wall, I might need R20, but if it's a solid mass wall, I only need R10. And that mass really only gives you that benefit if it's internal to any insulation you may have. I'm now building my churches out of concrete blocks that have foam insulation in the middle of the block. So it's essentially, it's sort of two concrete blocks that are either glued or sort of geometrically fit like puzzle pieces around an internal core of polystyrene insulation. And the insulation's not in the middle of the block, it's sort of towards the outside, but not all the way towards the outside. So that gives you the advantage that most of your thermal mass is still interior. But it also has the advantage that both sides of your wall are a solid masonry surface, so you don't need to use furring and lath to cover over styrofoam on the outside.
And the insulation goes right to the edge of the block and top and bottom. So basically it's a sandwich, is it? It's not encased within.
Yeah, there's several versions. I mean, there's a primitive version where it's just a regular concrete block, and there's just foam inserts that fit into the cavities. That's not as good because you get thermal bridging through the webbing. But there's more sophisticated versions where it's simply two concrete units that are either just glued to the styrofoam, or may have some plastic clips embedded in the concrete that holds the two sides together, but without any thermal bridging. It's kind of a new product, but there's a bunch of companies in America making all different versions of these insulated concrete blocks. And yeah, there are big cost savings because you can build a wall that doesn't require any particular finishing on either side, and you get an insulated mass wall in just a single construction step.
How thick are they? What's the depth
You can
typically?
get them in either 8-inch thick or 12-inch thick. Yeah, 12-inch thick is typically what I'd use for a church where the walls are pretty tall.
Yeah, that's big. I mean, another thing that is often overlooked as well is water, rainfall, water ingress, the importance of rainwater goods, keeping water off the fabric of the
Yeah.
building as much as you can, because the moment something gets wet, it will lose a lot of heat and draw in a lot of
Yeah.
not really drawing cold, but lose a lot of heat. So that's really important, and something that modern builds don't really acknowledge. You see such flat surfaces, even like no window sills, no cornice details, no overhang where the roof meets or at the eaves. These are really practical, functional details of a building that we think are ornamental and decorative, but actually they just serve the purpose of keeping a fabric dry so that it could stay, retain heat. So yeah.
One of the aesthetic advantages of thick walls, and I notice this at Mount Athos with the walls are massively thick, just you've got this beautiful depth of the windows, the reveals part of the architecture. So you get this contrast of light and dark all over, whereas if the windows are right up against the wall on the inside, forget about the outside at this stage, everything's just a skin effectively.
Yeah.
And I just loved looking at that. And often the edge of the reveal meeting the wall was rounded, very rarely were they sharp, and slightly undulating. So everything had this sense of, I don't know, movement and rhythm and
an articulation that's lacking now. And I think
and
people
not a strong distinction between wall and ceiling. You've got the pendative, of course, but a wall would become a barrel arch, or if it was going up to the drum, you get into the pendative, and then that would smoothly transition to the dome, to the drum, and then to the dome. So this sort of distinction of wall and ceiling is just so organically natural. I stayed at a village on an island, Sifnos, and even the outside was like that. They had this local grey stone for the paving with quite wide whitewashed joins, and then the same stone was used on the roofs, but the way that the road met the whitewashed walls, it was just a gradual transition, a curved one, and then the roofs became like the roadways. So the distinction between roof, wall, and road was just gone. It was just one organic whole without any sharp transitions. It was all sort of soft. And over the centuries, have been whitewashed, so they've become softer and curved. It's just a joy to watch.
Yeah, yeah. Well, you don't, I think, ever see rectilinear form in nature.
No.
Or organic systems. So, I mean, they can work for us in some ways, especially in terms of laying out an interior space. It might be hard to have a circular kitchen, for instance, or things like this. But yeah, generally speaking, this obsession with sharp lines and flat surfaces is so, like, it's such a contemporary phenomena that I think is so misleading.
It's the function of the modern materials we're making now with the slight imperfection of most natural materials. It's actually, you've got to work hard to get a sharp corner.
Yeah.
It's just more natural just to smooth things out and round things off. It's just more efficient, really.
Yeah, and it's more vulnerable. A sharp corner is much more
true.
vulnerable to the elements than a curve is. So, yeah.
Good. I'd love to keep talking, but we can chat afterwards. I've got a little project I want to tell you both about. Well, I've told Andrew about it, but you might be able to involved later, Nikki. Well, thank you so much, Andrew and Nikki, and I really know that lots of people are going to benefit from this, and I'll be sharing this on various media platforms. Thank you so much.
Thank
Wonderful.
you.
Well,
Thank you both.
thank you for hosting this, Aidan. It was a lovely idea.
Yeah, it's been absolutely